Welcome to the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security webinar. Today, we will be discussing Western media coverage of the war against Hamas in Gaza. Perhaps I should say Western media failures in covering the war in Gaza. We know that the social media is saturated with fabrications, lies, falsehoods. But what about the more reputable and prestigious media, traditional media, newspapers, television, and radio? How do they cover so far? How do they have covered so far the war in Gaza? We have seen several cases that are well known, but in this webinar, I think we would be arguing that the failures in covering the war in Gaza have not been isolated cases. They represent many years of field, professional, and ethical editing and presenting information and context for Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Even the best of the media, of outlets like the New York Times or the BBC, known for their reputation, have failed in adequately and professionally covering the war. And today we would like to discuss this issue. We will present evidence. Number two, we will explain the evidence. And third, we will discuss what effects the evidence has had on actors and public opinion and even policymakers. We have today three outstanding speakers with experience in researching this issue. Each will make an initial presentation of about 20 minutes, and then we will open the lines for questions and answers. And please, while you are listening to the initial presentations, you can hit the chat button to write questions. Please write short and brief questions. Altogether, we will have about 1 hour and a half, so we intend to end this session at 8:30 Israel time. The first speaker is Richard Landes. He is a professor emeritus of medieval history at Boston University. He invented the term Pallywood, which is a combination of Palestinian and Hollywood. He discovered and presented photos and videos about Palestinian fabrication of all kinds of events. And in 2022, he published a book titled "Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and Global Jihad." Was published by Academic Studies Press, and it seems to have forecasted what we have seen and witnessed in the present war in Gaza. Professor Landes, please.
Thank you. I'm going to share screen and do a PowerPoint. Let me know if this works. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like to discuss today is how the media plays out in terms of what I call cognitive war strategies. And I'll start just by outlining what the, hold on one sec. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the jihadi cannibal strategy, which is a cognitive war strategy, can be summed up in the notion that IDF soldiers and normal soldiers wear Kevlar to protect themselves. Hamas wears their own civilians to protect themselves. And what that does is, and it's really a unique phenomenon because most armies wouldn't play this game. They have a win-win. If they attack Israel and Israel does not respond, they win. If they attack and Israel retaliates, killing their civilians who are forced to be there as shields, they win doubly, in fact. They win first because international pressure builds on Israel to accept a ceasefire, which means that they can never be fully defeated. But even more, they win because the coverage of the dead civilians feeds a particularly dangerous narrative, which I think we've seen playing out today more than ever, which is that Israel is committing genocide. And I'll come back to the issue of what I call the anti-Semitic projection later on, but this is an enormous victory for them and for which they will willingly sacrifice their people in order to have that success. Now, this strategy can only work if the Western media complies with their demands. The Western media's assigned task is to report Palestinian suffering, and whether explicitly or implicitly, to make it look like Israel is responsible for that suffering. And I do think that one of the things that we should be doing is develop a Palestinian media protocols. They've already issued what they consider the press should be doing, and then we have a compliance index of how to what degree various news outlets and various journalists comply with the Palestinian media protocols. At this point, the New York Times, as we'll see in a moment, rates very high. And as we'll see now in my talk, CNN also rates very high. So a quick list of definitions. This is mostly for the sake of clarity as I talk. Cognitive warfare is an asymmetric warfare where the weaker side seeks to convince a more powerful enemy not to use their superior force. And in general, that historically has been guerrilla warfare to kick out imperialists, whether it's the Maccabees kicking out the Greeks or it's the Vietnamese kicking out the French and the Americans. On the other hand, there is a different form of warfare, invasive cognitive warfare, in which your task is to convince a more powerful enemy to stand down while you invade. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then three forms of war journalism: patriotic war journalism, when you run your own side's war propaganda, even fake news. You run it as news for the sake of your side. It's a common practice in much journalism, and particularly pre-modern journalism. By professional modern ethic, journalistic ethics, it's forbidden to do that. Lethal war journalism is in a foreign conflict, you run one side's war propaganda as news. In the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict, by and large, particularly since 2000, as I argue in my book, the media has frequently run Palestinian war propaganda, actual fake war propaganda like the Jenin massacre, as news, reluctantly corrects itself, if at all, when it's proven wrong, dismisses Israeli denials. We'll see this play out in the Al-Ahli hospital case that I'm about to discuss. So lethal war journalism is running in a foreign conflict, running one side's war propaganda as news. And then own goal war journalism, which I'm really interested to know how many earlier examples there are of this. It's rather suicidal. One runs one's own enemy's war propaganda as news. And the point I want to make at this point, just at the beginning, is that in order for an invasive cognitive war to succeed, you need own goal war journalists on the side of the culture or the country that you're invading to run your war propaganda. Okay, so let's take the Al-Ahli Hospital strike of October 17th, 2023 as an example. This happens 10 days after the October massacre. A rocket shot by jihadis falls in the parking lot of the Al-Ahli Hospital in Gaza. Its fuel tank explodes and probably around 20 people were killed. Hamas, with the help of Arab journalists and hospital staff, claimed that an Israeli strike on the hospital killed hundreds. The Western press, in pack lethal war journalist mode, take up the tale, attributing it to Palestinian sources. Jeremy Bowen of the BBC actually referred repeatedly to the fact that Israel had flattened the hospital. I can come back to that, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. CNN, which I record, and so I viewed their coverage literally hour by hour. CNN literally dropped absolutely everything to cover the story from the moment it broke. In other words, they didn't wait to hear the Israeli response. They didn't say, well, we're hearing reports, but we haven't. They immediately went into full mode. The journalist who was on for the first hour after the news broke had a business program. She didn't discuss any of the items that she surely had prepared that day. It was all 24/7 about Israel. So here we have the New York Times headline, Israeli strike kills hundreds in hospital, Palestinians say, and a picture from Khan Yunis of a destroyed building, which presumably anybody who isn't looking carefully would think is the hospital. This is how the New York Times headline evolved as it became clear that the original story wasn't entirely reliable. So in the second headline, Israel drops out of the headline. But the death toll, which was hundreds in the first headline, now becomes 500 and remains 500. And then in the third one, when it's pretty clear that it's not a strike, or the Israelis are claiming it's not a strike, they turn it into a blast. The CNN headline reads, Hamas, hundreds killed in Israeli strike on hospital in Gaza. The next day, after it became clear that it wasn't a strike on a hospital, we have, he said, she said, Israeli and Palestinian officials trade blame for hospital blast. This was actually so bad that this exchange you're about to see takes place with Becky Anderson at noon the following day. So everybody in the world has had a chance to look at the photos, to realize that it's a small crater in the parking lot, that there are no pictures of dead bodies, or there are some pictures of dead bodies, but nothing even remotely suggesting hundreds, much less 500 people. And everything that Israel presents to the news media, in this case to CNN, is then treated with exactly the opposite of what they treated the Hamas claims, with enormous doubt. And they keep saying, well, you know, we're not in a position to judge. Actually, anybody who looked at the pictures was in a position to judge, but they just sit on their hands and play the he said, she said game. And Peter Lerner finally got fed up with this and confronted Becky Anderson. Here's what happened.
If you're asking for proof, you know, you don't really want the proof. You just want to make sure you have the story. And unfortunately, there has been so much premature.
Hang on, I don't want you to suggest. Hang on, Peter. That is unfair. I do not want you to suggest that we are not seeking the truth. Peter Lerner, we are trying to seek the proof? And that was the question that I asked you, and you have provided what you can at this point, and I appreciate that. But please don't suggest that we're not trying to identify the truth, because that is exactly what we are doing, sir.
You'll never be content with whatever I share, because you'll ask for more and more and more and more. You know, when you can take what I say for face value, and as
Peter,
I said, you don't have to believe one.
I am reporting what other people, what the Palestinians are asking for.
But it's not the Palestinians. You are parroting what
Hamas is saying. I'm going to leave it there. It's good to have you, Peter Lerner. It's good to have you, sir.
Has been manipulating you.
Understood. We are trying to nail down the facts, and it's good to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's really interesting is that you can see that they have not looked at the evidence themselves, that they're constantly referring to the catastrophic scene and so on and so forth, well into the afternoon of the next day. And when Israelis expect them to respond to the evidence, they instead get this, well, we're not in a position to judge. So the impact of this was huge, reported by CNN largely in terms of its impact on the Arab world, riots, Biden's meeting with Arab leaders interrupted, and now we'll see this scene with Christian Amanpour discussing just how striking this development, which they're part of, has led to.
You had called this, as we were speaking before, an unmitigated disaster, essentially, for the president. How does President Biden leave Israel? What is the possibility?
Poppy, in my memory, a president has not been cancelled by Arab leaders. This is an unprecedented situation, and it is coming at a massive importance to talk to those Arab leaders in order to be shown to be actually trying to figure out how to de-escalate.
All right, enough. You don't have to hear more of it, but in a sense, what you have is CNN looking at the damage that they're causing and reporting it as news. And they don't seem in any way troubled by the fact that they have participated in blowing up these meetings. Now, what they don't report is the impact specifically of Western coverage. In other words, they can say to themselves, oh, well, you know, the Arab press was reporting this, and that's why this happened in the Arab world. But in the Western world, it's because of reports like theirs. And basically, it broke Israel's back in world opinion. The pro-Palestinian demonstrations got a huge wind in their sails. Israel lost the sympathy that it had briefly gained through the sacrifice of over 1,000 people in a horrendous attack, and many who might have begun rethinking this conflict fell back immediately into the Israel-Goliath narrative. This was, I think, an absolutely critical turning point in the cognitive war for Gaza. And of course, this reinforces the standard anti-Zionist meme, which is Israel wantonly kills innocents. And in the long run, and that's what's happened since, because the media continues to report in this way, this coverage legitimates the circulation in the Western public sphere of the great projection Israel is committing genocide, when in fact it's the Palestinians who would like to do that. Now, what are the lessons of this news coverage? The first lesson that I take is the West is obsessed with Israel. I mean, you know, Mahmoud Darwish actually told an Israeli journalist in the 60s that the only reason that their cause is popular is because of who their enemy is. I can't imagine how the Ukrainians feel when they are in desperate shape and the media is just obsessed 24/7, CNN 24/7 with what's going on here. The second point I'd make is that the news media is addicted to the narrative of Palestinian suffering, and this is where they get their high compliance with Palestinian media protocols. In particular, and I'll show this in a moment, they're mesmerized by what I called Pallywood back in 2005, namely brief clips of not necessarily stage scenes. In this case, I don't think they're staged. I think these are real dead bodies, but they're put together in such a way as to suggest a massive event when in fact there's no evidence that there's a massive event. And I've already discussed the double standards of instantly accepting Hamas and resisting Israeli information as much as possible. All right, so here is Julia Chatterley, I believe. She has a business program. And she's what I'm going to show you here is the clip that they use to illustrate the claim that Israel hit a hospital and that people in their minds are still, and they repeat this over and over again, are still being, are yet to be taken out of a rubble that doesn't exist.
Palestinian officials say an Israeli airstrike appears to have killed hundreds of people at a hospital in Gaza City. The Ministry of Health says up to 300 people are dead. Hamas says the blast killed many displaced people taking shelter. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has declared 3 days of mourning and has cancelled a planned meeting with US President Joe Biden following the strike. A spokesman for the Israeli Prime Minister says Israel does not target hospitals, only Hamas strongholds, arms depots, and terror targets.
Okay, so there's nothing in those photos to suggest that a hospital has been struck or flattened, that there are bodies being dug out of the rubble, that there are hundreds of bodies, etc. And I would say this is, so here we've got Anderson Cooper with some new pictures 8 hours after the blast.
It is 3 a.m. here in Israel, which is, even at this late hour, dealing with the repercussions of a human tragedy on a terrible, terrible scale. The massive explosion at a hospital in Gaza City. We should say at the outset, the pictures are as horrible as the incident itself. We want to show you new video just moments after the blast. Hundreds are believed dead. We're talking about men, women, and children, civilians. More may still be buried in rubble at the Al Ali Baptist Hospital. According to the Hamas-run Palestinian Health Ministry, the hospital not only had patients and doctors and nurses inside, but thousands of displaced people outside who had been seeking shelter there, displaced from the bombings that had been going on in Gaza, compounding the loss of life.
You'll notice that. Now that's
Richard,
back to the,
Richard,
yeah.
2 minutes, please. 2 minutes, please.
Okay, so you'll notice that they went through the same loop 3 times and nothing in those photos suggested anything of what he's reporting happened. I'll skip the death toll issue, but broadly speaking, the one thing the media wouldn't let go of was the incredibly high estimate of dead, even after they saw the damage that had actually been caused by the blast in the parking lot. What they do is play on Western compassion. So here I'm going to give you, this is Mustafa Barghouti. He's going to give you statistics and then tell you, but that's real people.
In reality, what we see here is a process not only of dehumanization of Palestinians, but also an act of annihilation. So far, Israel killed 6,000 Palestinians in Gaza. They also killed 2,400 innocent children. These are not numbers.
Okay. Now we have a humanitarian doctor giving her
These
report.
numbers, but they're not numbers. 3,600 children at least that we've been able to count in the death toll. The rest are still trapped under the rubble, so they can't be counted.
All right, I'll spare you that. Now we have the anchor picking up her
Because
language.
as you say, every child, every person who's been injured or is suffering at this hour is somebody's everything.
So what are my conclusions? First of all, the media, whether intentionally or unconsciously, is serving as a major player in Hamas's cognitive warfare, in its strategy against Israel, and they're not only doing lethal journalism, but it's also own goal war journalism. Secondly, there's a need literally for a new school of journalists. Journalists need to be prepared for what they're dealing with, and they're completely unprepared. I think that Israel should have a training course for journalists to take. If they don't want to take it, they don't have to. But if they want access to important high-level people, they should have this course under their belt before they can have access to those levels. But I think the most significant thing is Hamas's cruelly cynical appeal to Western compassion works both on journalists and on the public. It's caught us in a loop where every time we defend ourselves, we strengthen the mirror propaganda of genocidal anti-Semites globally, that we are the ones committing genocide. And if we don't find a solution to that compassion trap, we're in really bad shape, and so is the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And you focused on the Al-Hali case, and the next presentation will place this case in a much broader and long-term context and trends. And our next speaker is Lilac Sigan. She's the author of several novels, including most recently Words Apart. It's available on Amazon. And for several years, she has been closely following coverage of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the New York Times, just the New York Times. And based on her research, myself and her conducting research and preparing articles for scholarly and professional outlets. Lilac, please.
Hi, thank you, Eytan. Okay, so you've already seen the Al-Ali incident, which is really a very major, I agree with Richard talking before, it was a major turning point in the way the war was covered. And I'm going to talk specifically about the coverage of the New York Times. And I'm going to start with the editor's note, actually, because after everything that Richard told you before, there was so much criticism about this report that the New York Times was kind of forced to publish a very rare editor's note. It was rare in its salience. It was very, conspicuous. It was long. There was a 20-minute podcast of the editor-in-chief talking about this, saying how they have to reflect about the way they cover the how they cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I just highlighted what I think is the most important part of the editor's note, saying the early versions of the coverage and the prominence it received in a headline, news alert, and social media channels relied too heavily on claims by Hamas and did not make clear that those claims could not immediately be verified. The report left readers with an incorrect impression. It's oops, something is, sorry about that. My presentation, I'm going to try to load it again. Something was stuck. Okay. You have seen the headline before, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. I want to talk a little bit about the criticism, because there was so much anger at the way specifically the New York Times covered this. It was one of the last ones to talk about the Israeli proof, the IDF proof. And we had the IDF had a lot of proof showing that this was a jihadi rocket, etc. But it took the New York Times a very long time to agree to say that the jihadi rocket actually did not fall on the hospital, that the death toll was a lot less than reported initially. And these are just some of the criticisms and what we know. I'm just going to read you one critique that was published on Semaphore. President Joe Biden raged against New York Times. He thought the headline was irresponsible and could have triggered military escalation in the Middle East. The summit was canceled, as Richard said. He fumed in particular that the headline had appeared in an American newspaper. just like you said, you're not the only one who thinks so. But what I want to talk about is how rare was this hospital incident? Let's see if some more examples of blunders by the New York Times during the war. On October 20th, the New York Times rehired a Hitler-praising journalist, photojournalist, actually, to cover the Israel-Hamas war. He started contributing again after being fired about a year and a half ago. The New York Times did not disclose why they rehired this photojournalist. It just happened. This is a New York Post piece about it. On November 3rd, another New York Times writer resigned over an open letter that she signed accusing Israel of genocide, which means she's not exactly impartial about this subject. On November 8th, I'm sure you've seen this. It was, made a lot of waves. Honest Reporting, which is a media watchdog, published a very good investigation about the photojournalists that accompanied the Hamas terrorists on October 7th and were there very early in the morning to take photos of the fence, of people being kidnapped, and how ethical was that? The New York Times starred in this investigation, but was not the only one. But it was the only one that actually attacked Honest Reporting, said there was no evidence to support claims that the photographers knew in advance. The investigation, by the way, did not suggest that they knew in advance. It just asked questions that called for an investigation. Of course, the New York Times did not want any investigation, stood by its photojournalist, and did not fire that photojournalist. On November 25th, we have another very long article suggesting that the Gazan civilians are being killed at historic pace. One of the examples given in this article was that there are more dead civilian Gazans that were killed than there were Ukrainian civilians in the Russian-Ukraine war, which is completely false. Only in Mariupol alone, there were more dead civilians than in Gaza. And this here is a critique that was published about this article in the Seventh Eye. What happened was that at some point, the New York Times realized that these numbers are false. They don't really work. So they just cut off that sentence and did not even tell the readers that there was a correction made. But this sentence still appears in this article where it was syndicated. It was syndicated in other media outlets, and it still appears there. So it's not that rare. Now I want to look back with you on some examples before 2023, before the war, from 2017 to 2022, and I'll give some major examples that we found. The first one is an article from December 2022 by a journalist called Raja Abdul Rahim about the devastated, destroyed fishing industry in Gaza because of the siege. Another media watchdog, Camera, approached the New York Times, showed them Palestinian data that shows the exact opposite, that the Gaza fishing industry actually doubled in the last 15 years and even more than doubled. So what they did not retract the article. It still appears in their archive, but they put in an editor's note. So this is an admission, another admission of a failure. It's a very vague, not really an apology. It says that they have, the annual catch has varied from year to year. It has actually doubled, as I said, but this was the editor's note. In November 2021, there was an article by another New York Times journalist, Patrick Kingsley. He wrote about a Palestinian professor who supposedly calmly teaches Israeli poetry in Gaza University, and portrayed him as a very, peace-seeking, bridge-building, open-minded kind of person. Only this man's social media and also his classes on YouTube are filled with hatred and filth against Jews, against Zionists, really stuff that I don't want to repeat here. And so here we have another editor's note about more information coming in, and perhaps they did not portray things in a very accurate way. I'm going to go back with you to April 2019. The New York Times published this cartoon. You may have heard of this as well. It caused a huge uproar for being anti-Semitic, and the New York Times actually apologized for publishing an anti-Semitic cartoon. And on April 2017, I have an example of an op-ed by Marwan Barghouti, Why We Are on Hunger Strike in Israel's Prisons. He was presented as a Palestinian prisoner and politician, but his crimes, which are multiple terror crimes, were omitted from the byline, and the public editor, who still existed in the New York Times in those days, published this piece saying an op-ed author omits his crimes, and the New York Times does too. So obviously the hospital incident was not very rare. So what Eytan and I did, we went back to check the coverage, the consistent systemic coverage of Israel in the New York Times for one whole calendar year. We picked 2022 because this was a year that was, first of all, it's before everything that happened this year. This year was a very volatile year with a judicial overhaul, with a right-wing government. It drew a lot of criticism. We wanted something, we wanted a year that there was not supposed to be a lot of criticism about Israel. And if you remember, these were different times. We had a unity government. It was very inclusive and very diverse, and things that a liberal newspaper is supposed to like. So this is the year, and an Arab party for the first time in Israel's history. So let's see how Israel was covered during this year. I just want to say that we didn't only check the coverage, but also the omissions. So we checked out how what the tone was on all the items published about Israel, but also tracked separately all the items that were widely published by at least 3 media outlets in Israel in English about incidents that have to do with the Israeli side of the conflict. For instance, rockets being shot at, being fired at Israel, or a terror attack, or things of the sort. So let's talk about the coverage first. Let's look at the coverage during this year. First of all, 53% of the coverage of Israel was negative. Only 11% was positive. If we want to talk about, the unity government was present during January to October. The elections actually took place on November 1st. So during the first 10 months, the coverage was 51% negative. It leaped afterwards in the last 2 months after the election of the right-wing government to 63% negative, but it was mostly negative in the first 10 months as well. Let's look at the op-ed section. There, it's even worse. 65% of the op-eds during 2022, the op-eds about Israel, were negative. 23% were positive, if you want to look at the bright side. I do have one interesting thing to say about this, because there were more negative op-eds about Israel during 2022 than there were about Iran. And this was a year during which there were the months of the hijab protests, if you remember, and a lot of discussion and discourse about the nuclear deal. But still, Israel had more negative op-eds. Israel was covered with more negative op-eds than Iran during 2022, which is supposed to be a subtle year on Israeli criticism. I just want to give you one example of some of the over-reporting during 2022. You probably remember the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist that was killed in crossfire in Jenin and was heavily reported. But let's look at the larger picture. During 2022, there was a total of 65 journalists that were killed in duty. It was the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war. 15 of these journalists died in Ukraine only. Some of them were American. So, Shireen Abu Akleh was also an American citizen, but some of the other journalists that died in Ukraine were also American. One of them was even a New York Times contributor. There were 14 journalists that died, that were killed in Mexico. And most of these, and only one journalist that was accidentally and tragically killed in Israel. Most of these deaths here on this graph were not even reported in the New York Times, but the ones that were covered with a total of 16 headlines for all of them put together. Shireen Abu Akleh's tragic death was covered with 24 separate news items and articles, including one special investigation, just to show you how disproportionate this is. Now let's talk about the omissions. First of all, let's look at the headlines, okay? And I just want to say before that 2022 was a peak terror year in Israel. It was there were even more terror attacks tracked compared with the last peak, which is in 2015. Over 200 significant terror attacks, according to the ISA. And this was a very terror-filled year. So during this year, Israel was covered with 361 stories and items. 192 of them were negative. Hezbollah was mentioned in the headlines and subheadlines of only 4 items, and only one of them was negative. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad was mentioned only in 2 headlines in the New York Times. Both of them were negative. And Hamas was mentioned in only 2 headlines and subheadlines as well. Only one of them was negative. So you can see the immense disproportion here. It's not just the headlines. These are the references. How many times were Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas mentioned in the New York Times within the text or anywhere? Really very few times, especially compared to Israel. And when we talk about the separate incidents, there were 377 events in Hebrew about the conflict from the Israeli side that were widely published. 276 stories about events, not stories about the same event, but separate stories about separate events that were widely published in at least 3 media outlets in English and were omitted by the New York Times. Most of these stories were about Palestinian threats, and when I say Palestinian threats, it's usually Palestinian terror, incitement, etc. Let's talk about historical facts because, when we talk about context, and also we should take into account that the New York Times is a newspaper of record, which means that people can use it for research and, for knowing what happened historically in all sorts of places. So let's look at the background facts that they put in their articles during this year. Israel, along with the words occupied, occupation, etc., were mentioned 416 times. Israel in 1967 or 1948 were mentioned in various articles 129 times. These are the Palestinian arguments as for the conflict with the Israelis, whereas the Israeli arguments, which are the peace offer rejections, the repeated rejections by Palestinian leadership, hardly got any mentions at all. They were mentioned 21 times throughout the year. The word disengagement with Israel and Gaza, by the way, was not present even once in the New York Times during the whole year of 2022, but there were 12 mentions of the words Israel and Gaza with withdrew, or withdrawal. All in all, you can see that the Israeli arguments are minimized and the Palestinian arguments are repeated pretty obsessively. More about the omissions. Major terror leaders that were simply ignored. Hassan Nasrallah and the word terrorist did not appear together at all in any articles in the New York Times during 2022. Yahya Sinwar and the word terrorist appeared together twice in articles during 2022. But Itamar Ben-Gvir and the word terrorist appeared 20 times. Now, I just want to stress that Itamar Ben-Gvir was convicted of supporting terrorism. So it's okay to mention that. There's nothing wrong with mentioning it, but the proportions are very worrying. So what are the main insights of our studies? First of all, does the New York Times use journalism ethics when it covers the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I'm afraid the answer is pretty much no, because it's not loyal to being accurate. And if I look at this, this is from the Journalist Code of Ethics. Journalists are supposed to provide context, take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting, previewing, or summarizing a story. I can't say that the New York Times does that. I just want to kind of demonstrate what I have seen the New York Times do during this whole year. If this is the whole story of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and it has two halves, the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, what the New York Times does is amp up the reporting of the Palestinian side and minimize and omit most of the other half, the Israeli side. And what we get is a very distorted story. So our conclusion is that the New York Times cannot be relied on to provide accurate and unbiased information, context, and commentary about Israel and about the conflict with the Palestinians.
Thank you very much, Lilac.
Thank you.
And this is really, the evidence is really very disturbing, because many scholars and students and intellectuals, elites, they rely on the New York Times for reliable and accurate information, and perhaps this is not the case.
Exactly.
We will be moving now to our third speaker, Owen Alterman. Is a senior diplomatic correspondent at the I-24 News. Perhaps you have seen him, and if you are not follow I-24 News, you should. I-24 is a television channel. He was born in the United States in the Detroit metropolitan area and made Aliyah to Israel in 2010. Previously, he served as a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. He holds a BA in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University and a JD from Harvard Law School. And I can say that he is one of the best diplomatic correspondents working in Israel. He is following not only events abroad, but also coverage of those events. Owen, please.
Well, thank you so much, Eytan. And I want to thank also Professor Landis and Lilac. And Lilac and you, Eytan, for your research. I mean, two really impressive and thought-provoking presentations, I think, that give us a lot of food for thought. I am going to be, on the one hand, a little bit more forgiving of the journalist. I guess that comes from being a journalist who's tasked with looking at these things day in, day out. But at the same time, I think there's almost a kind of hidden optimism in both of those presentations. And sadly, I think I'm going to end by being potentially much more pessimistic. You know, when you think about this, I think they're two separate and in a sense disjointed from one another water metaphors that come to mind. The first is the famous water metaphor cliche from Steve Bannon, which we'll adjust here, that media is downstream from culture. Or in a sense, media is downstream, I'll say, from culture, technology, and demographics. And the second is the water metaphor we all became familiar with during other crises like the financial crisis back in 2008 or the pandemic, that when the tides go out, right, you see the weak institutions and the weaknesses within institutions that are stuck. And I think a crisis like this one, a crisis, of course, not just for Israel or for people in Gaza, but for international media organizations, in a sense, shows the real weaknesses. In this case, I think less so about their business model and more so about the real weaknesses in their ethical model and the challenges to them. Because when you actually look not at how we see things, but how the journalists themselves see this conflict, the ones who are covering it, what they say when they're asked, what they write when they're trying to write about and explain the dilemmas that they see and they face, they find themselves caught in an impossible situation. And I think there are four sets of tensions that they're facing: partisan, generational, geographical, and technological. And the first two that are partisan and well, I'll say first of all, partisan and geographical. We'll talk about those two in a pair. Those are about how to apply the ethical code as it is, where the tension is about whether the New York Times, for example, is standing up for it, is being aligned with its ethical code and complying with its own ethical code, and the two sides pushing it to do so. And the other tensions, the generational tension and the technological tension, call into question the ethical code itself. And so in a sense, are more fundamental. First, we'll start with the partisan one, because that's the most well-trodden one in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The fact that this is the most scrutinized news story in the world, where there are two sides that are heavily invested in the media coverage, which have, certainly on our side, but I think increasingly on the Palestinian side too, institutions and organizations that work full-time to scrutinize the media, which I think is great. And I know from experience talking to at least one New York Times correspondent who was based here, albeit a long time ago, he thought this was great and helped him do his job better. But at the same time, it's obviously very, very hard for journalists who in some cases come to this conflict not having worked on it, come to the position in Israel not having covered anything like it, and had worked in places where their work was simply less scrutinized, and then come here into the cauldron, let alone in the middle of a war like this one, and find two sides who each feel that they're being wronged by the media. We certainly saw the proof that our side brings to bear to this, and those two terrific presentations, certainly about the egregious incident with the Al-Ali hospital, for which there's really no reasonable defense. And on the other side, it just takes a quick Google search to look at what the other side is saying about the Gaza war in the Western media and the biases that they see, rightly or wrongly. But those contentions are there, and the journalists covering this conflict are targeted with them and have to deal with them and have to manage these two sides and the tension between them. Again, that's an established set of tensions. That's an established tension. But obviously, when you put it into an event like this one, in some senses unprecedented in 75 years of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it becomes all the more difficult for them. The second tension is the geographical tension. You know, we titled this panel Western Media Outlets. But in a certain sense, these institutions, certainly CNN, but also the New York Times, notwithstanding the geographical moniker in its name, aspire not just to be Western media outlets in the 21st century, but global media outlets, serving an audience in Nicaragua or India or Nepal or Germany or Britain or Australia or Israel or Egypt or Gaza. To the same degree, they're serving an audience in the United States. And that brings into focus a whole host of tensions. You know, Sarah Leah Whitson, a name some of us, may be familiar with, the former worker at Human Rights Watch, of course, now set up her own human rights, as she puts it, NGO, of course, no friend of the state of Israel, gets on a panel for the Council of Foreign Relations and says, your organizations have a pro-US bias. Why are you assuming or using as a starting point the idea and the concept that the US is a positive actor in the Middle East? Look at all the nasty things the United States does in the Middle East. And the people and the journalists on the panel said that they struggle with the question. Well, one possible answer is that, yes, there is a slight pro-American bias in an American media organization, that the starting point for an American media organization may well be that the United States is a positive actor, or at least an actor who's acting in good faith. Not that that presumption can't be challenged or the United States can't be criticized in coverage, but at least there could be at least a finger on the scale for that presumption. But that answer wasn't given. And I think the reason is that these outlets don't see themselves as American media organizations. Tom Friedman famously said that in the new era of the New York Times, he needs to teach someone in Israel something new about Israel, or someone in China something new about China. He doesn't see himself as writing for an American audience. He sees himself writing for a global audience. And in an age where the educational and economic gaps between countries are narrowing, of course, within countries, at least the economic gaps are widening, but between countries, those gaps are narrowing. There are more readers than ever and viewers than ever for these international news organizations with their own ways of looking at the world. And it makes it much, much harder, I think, for these journalists to do their job and to try to be in a place where they can gain the trust of an even more varied group of readers or group of viewers. And that, of course, is a long-term trend, but it's ramped up in recent decades with the advent of the internet, and even more so, again, as those gaps narrow, and felt even more in a conflict like this, which is beyond the way we, of course, as Israelis, are directly affected by it, but emotionally, so many populations around the world are affected by it. And let's not forget, and this will come back at the end, the simple demographics that once you're speaking not just to an American audience, but to a worldwide audience, you know, frankly, those who feel an emotional affiliation to the Palestinian side are far more numerous than those who feel an emotional affiliation to the Israeli side. It's simply a matter of math. And I think the journalists feel that, and feel that more than they may have in the past. And it obviously makes it much more difficult for us. And there I humbly disagree with Mahmoud Darwish. I don't think this conflict resonates, at least not at this stage, because of who the Palestinians' enemies are. I think it resonates because of who the Palestinians' friends are or natural allies are. And I think that that's something that these news organizations feel. Then there's the generational tension within the United States. Look, we've all seen the polling. I confess I'm obsessed with it and have very particular opinions about it. The polling of 18 to 29-year-olds or 18 to 24-year-olds, depending on the age breakdown in the polls, and the changes in attitudes in the United States towards this conflict. We can argue, and we should argue, about what the story is behind those attitudes. And again, I have a very distinct set of opinions about them, at least provisional opinions. I think we need to study it a lot more to get to some firmer conclusions. But at this point, it is not arguable that there is a generation gap in attitudes on this conflict in American public opinion. I think that's, at this point, beyond dispute. And that's felt in newsrooms. And here, there is that difference about how the ethical code is approached. In the past two tensions, right, the partisan tension and the geographical tension, the assumption is that the New York Times should be objective in covering the conflict, right? And the question is the New York Times living up to its ethical standard? But when you look at the generational tension in the United States and you read what the journalists are saying among themselves, particularly an article in the Columbia Journalism Review, the question is, should the New York Times be objective? And this is an idea and a concept that germinated in the George Floyd incident. And what was sown there is being reaped now. There, the feelings were so raw and the emotions were so strong that the argument was made that an outlet like the New York Times simply couldn't be objective and had to simply advocate for racial justice. To which the answer, maybe later on by A.G. Sulzberger, was there's a distinction between issues that are of a broad social consensus, such as the horrific killing of George Floyd, or later on, the war in Ukraine, where there was a broad consensus in the United States, at least about the merits of who was right and who was wrong, maybe some debate about what the United States should do about it, between cases such as those and a case such as this one, where, of course, there are generational differences, but there's no consensus in American public opinion, to say the least, about our conflict. And there, the New York Times objectivity should be more firm. But that's being called into question by a younger generation of journalists. And Lilac discussed the incident of that New York Times Magazine writer and a few others at the New York Times who protested, who participated in pro-Palestinian protests, or signed pro-Palestinian or pro-Hamas letters, and either resigned or were fired. And their contention was they saw no conflict between doing that and doing their jobs. The argument in one case was, I don't cover this subject, so why can't I do that? And the answer for the New York Times was, we have this code and you have to abide by it. Again, the generational conflict isn't only about who's right and who's wrong in our conflict. It's about what the ethical code of the New York Times should be, And that brings us to the fourth tension, of course, technology. These media companies, as we all well know, are being challenged by social media. And social media has different rules or no rules, which again brings into question how high should the standards of media organizations be and what types of standards in order to win the war against social media. And in a sense, again, this goes to the heart of their business model too, so it's not only an ethical issue. And, what to do about this issue of objectivity, where on social media, objectivity is simply not kept at a premium. So these tensions, they've been there and they're longer term trends, but in a crisis such as this one, like the tides going out, a lot of these weaknesses and tensions become more exposed. And I just think it becomes a lot harder for these journalists to do their jobs. I mean, one case study, which to me, if you talk about failures of Western media or global media during this war, it's this issue of journalists in Gaza. To many of the journalists working at these media organizations, journalists in Gaza are heroes. These are the paragons of what journalism should be. People who are literally risking their lives to go out and get the story, to film and to report at real personal danger to themselves and to their lives. And obviously, there are strong elements of truth to that. I mean, there are journalists who have been killed, let alone had their families killed and be in a very, very difficult situation. Again, I'm not saying Israel caused it, but that's the reality of their situation. But of course, we know that along with that, those important elements of what those journalists are doing, they're acting under conditions where they simply can't be objective. Some of them don't want to because they're Hamas partisans, including, of course, at least one of those who was profiled in the Honest Reporting report. But even those who want to be objective, who want to be fair, simply can't because of the conditions, the social conditions and the political conditions of Hamas being involved. And this is an issue that, of course, long predates this war, and where I think that during this war, and certainly before, media organizations have done an incredibly poor job of warning their readers and of warning their viewers, saying, listen, we are doing the best we can to get you information, firsthand information from Gaza. But you, dear reader and dear viewer, need to know that we cannot provide you information that meets our usual standards of reliability because of the conditions there and the conditions under which these reporters work. So there is an imbalance in terms of the information we're allowed to deliver from Israel, where there isn't the same kind of acute issue of personal safety, and Israel and reporters are operating in a democracy versus the conditions in Gaza. And this is an imbalance there. And in this, and I strongly agree with Professor Landis, where the Western media are being played, or the global media are being played, and need to do more to warn their viewers and warn their readers. And Israel needs to do a better job of taking them to task and forcing them to do so. One thing that is interesting when we think about this is we are coming at this subject with an assumption that I think is actually a counterintuitive assumption, but a correct assumption. We are assuming that mainstream media matters. And it's counterintuitive because we all know about the rise of social media, the increasing use of social media to get news, the declining influence of mainstream media, the declining trust in mainstream media, and all the rest. But the reality is that mainstream media is still very, very important. They're important in setting the tone, sometimes maybe for social media, though, of course, as we discussed, it works the other way around. And also, there is still a significant chunk of the public that turns to mainstream media. If you look, for example, at the New York Times poll, at the crosstabs of the New York Times poll on the war, and I strongly encourage everyone with an interest in this war or in Israel to do so. Those crosstabs have a wealth of information, and I think we should all agree that we owe a debt of gratitude to the New York Times for running that poll and for providing that information. Some of the news there is horrible for Israel, but at least we get those facts so that we can learn from them and be able to respond to them. But one of the pieces of information there, not only there, I think also in the Harvard-Harris crosstabs too, is that there is a significant segment of that younger generation that is still turning to mainstream media outlets, particularly cable news channels, right? I think it's 20-30% of them who are still turning. And that's a large percent. It stands to reason, although I don't know that this is true, that it's the more educated segment and maybe a more influential segment. So the stakes are still fairly high for how mainstream media cover this conflict, and it's rightly a source of focus. And it is important for Israel to at least do the basics of investing in this field and trying to be part of it, because again, one of these tensions is partisan, and simply, if Israel's not on the field, not playing, then the other side will be the only one there, to put it bluntly. So it's important for Israel's effort to be out there. I have to say, I didn't love the clip with Peter Lerner on CNN. I don't think that was the best approach to these situations. And I think we've learned that through some of the, in my opinion, more successful moves by Israeli spokespeople over the course of this war, where in my opinion, on balance, our spokesperson's operation has overperformed expectations and overperformed the past. The Al-Ali hospital incident is very, very interesting because so much damage was caused in the first 2 hours where Israel was basically silent. And the only response in that CNN clip, in one of the CNN clips we saw from the opening hours, is the Israeli Prime Minister's office says Israel doesn't target hospitals, which, by the way, in parentheses, isn't strictly speaking true. As we all know, Israel did target hospitals later on because those hospitals were used by Hamas. But at any rate, that was the real and full presentation only came the next morning. Again, we can talk about, it seems to me overall, anyway, we're going in a tangent. The point being, it is important for Israel to be part of this and to be focused on mainstream media, among other elements, and of course, social media being part of it as well. But, and this is where the pessimism comes in. The reality is that media, as I said, is downstream from culture. And the increasing tensions on the media are tensions that, by their nature, do not play to Israel's favor. The generational gap and the changes in demographics in the United States, the geographical tension with increasing interest in audiences outside the United States, where there are different views on this conflict, almost by definition, the proliferation of social media, and particularly TikTok. It is not as easy to haul TikTok to a hearing before Congress as it is the leaders of Meta and of X, simply because it's Chinese owned. And as that medium becomes more popular, especially among younger generations, it just amplifies the challenges of social media and gives governments fewer tools to deal with TikTok, to the extent where what we've seen is governments either banning TikTok in the case of Montana or telling employees to take TikTok off their phones in the case of the European Union. But these tensions, it seems to me, are beyond the capacity of mainstream media to solve. They're simply caught in the middle. I think they're largely, although not entirely, but largely beyond the capacity of Israel to influence. So the sort of implicit optimism in both of the presentations that if only we get the CNN to listen to us, if only we get the New York Times to listen to us, this is a problem that can be solved in a situation that can be ameliorated. I tend to be more pessimistic and feel that our tools are much more limited. Not that we shouldn't try, not that we shouldn't use tools, but that just as in the situation with the polling and to a lesser degree with the campuses, here too, this is a situation where Israel simply has to think about adaptation and not only mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oren. Richard and Lilac addressed evidence about bias and failed coverage, but Owen provided some information about an explanation of why this has been happening, and also he spoke a little bit about effects. And we have a few questions. Question number one was about the availability of these presentations. They will be available as presentations, but Lilac and myself are going to produce a few articles. One of them is going to be available hopefully soon on the website of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. And so this is one. The second question was about the New York Times admitted errors in a positive article about Israel. Has it ever happened, Lilac?
Not that I know. I did try to look to do a study of all the editor's notes and all the corrections. I don't have the data yet. I hope I will. I'm trying to look into that. But the faults are usually on the Israeli side. I don't have the exact data, but most of the faults are Israeli. There are corrections, but they're very minor. I've seen some very minor corrections about a name or saying about a he or not a she, or stuff, very minor things that matter to certain people. But don't matter so much about the subject.
Okay. Richard, I want to ask you about effects. And in your book, you are linking negative and false coverage to levels of anti-Semitism since the massacre, the Hamas's massacre, and the beginning of the war in Gaza. We have seen increases of a few hundreds% of in anti-Semitic incidents, both in the United States and European countries. Can you say a little bit more about the connection between coverage and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, what's interesting about what happened as a result of 10/7 or 7/10, depending on whether you're an American or not, is that previously there was a very strong correlation between what I call lethal journalism. You know, take the case in 2014 of Al-Shati refugee camp hit by a Hamas rocket shortfall, but reported immediately the way Al-Ahli hospital was as an Israeli strike. And there was a huge spike, particularly in Britain, where the BBC was particularly egregious in its coverage, a huge spike in attacks on Jews as part of demonstrations, etc. In France, one crowd was in the Place de la Bastille yelling "Mort aux Juifs" for hours, literally hours, and then went off and attacked a synagogue that was full of people. That we'd seen before, but previously it had been cases where the media was showing Palestinian suffering. Now, after 10/7, we have Israeli suffering and attacks on Jews. And that, I think, is extremely worrisome because essentially it argues that we now have a full identification amongst people who consider themselves progressives with one of the most regressive genocidal organizations on the planet. And as a result, I see that, I mean, you know, my field of study is apocalyptic and millennial movements. That's the signs of an apocalyptic movement taking. And as the historians of these movements have pointed out, once they take, they're like forest fires. It's very hard to put them out. And I think that Owen's remarks show us, I mean, I was impressed, Owen, that you could find the hidden optimism in my talk. But I think that what he's showing us, and it coincides with what I say, which is if we can't get a hold of this compassion trap, if the images of Israel damaging the force causing Palestinian suffering continue to be the main feed, not just of the mainstream media, but of, you know, X, etc., then, you know, you're dealing with a situation in which every time we act, we are contributing to anti-Semitism. And this came up right at the beginning of the process that I think we're now stuck in, which was 2000, 2002. After the Jenin massacre, you know, there were a whole bunch of Jews like Tony Judt, and, well, they were referred to as a Jew, who, you know, all of a sudden they had never identified as Jews, and they come out as Jews and say, I must denounce what Israel's doing. And part of their complaint was, we're innocent, we're suffering from what Israel does. No, they were suffering from what the media reported that Israel did. And when they were given the choice of either criticizing the media or criticizing their own people, they went after their own people. And now it's even worse with organizations like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace and so on. So yeah, no, I think there's an extremely close link. And I think it's something that by and large Israelis, certainly in 2000, weren't, you know, most Israelis were raised to believe that Israel had put an end to anti-Semitism. That was part of the Zionist ideology and the sort of program. So I think it's very hard for Israelis to understand this. And I think it's very hard for, Owen was talking about the difficult situation of the media in covering this, and I have lots to say about that, but I won't say it now. But I think that, diaspora Jews are in a terrible situation because they really have to choose between being critical of the media and losing any support they have amongst their liberal colleagues, or joining their liberal colleagues and then saying it's because of what Israel's doing that we're under attack. Israel is causing the anti-Semitism.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Lilac, I want to ask you.
Owen wants to say something.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Now,
I have some very quick comments to take off of that, if I may. First of all,
Okay.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Geneva. I remember in 2002 reading the articles in the 4 main British newspapers, which are all essentially identical.
Yes,
and it just felt
excellent.
so fake. I just have to say it at that gut level. I just remember going through that reading experience and how, in a sense, traumatic it was. And obviously, American Jewish liberalism is in a true crisis, although I have actually been surprised at how many on the and how far into the American Jewish left sympathy or a sense of connection with Israel has come since October 7th. But of course, that's another discussion. But apropos to what you were saying in terms of the compassion trap and winning compassion, that's a problem that we have to untie in Israel. Because on the one hand, Israel wants to sound to audiences of these media outlets, Israel wants to sound weak. But to the leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, Israel wants to sound strong.
Yeah.
So Yoav Gallant, every Monday and Thursday, to use that Hebrew expression, goes into the Gaza Strip or goes up to the border with Lebanon, gets in front of the cameras, and gives a threatening speech about Gaza or about Lebanon to send a message to the other side. That is at absolute cross purposes with everything that you want to do. And on the other hand, sending, people who had horrific situations in the Gaza envelope or in Sderot or in Kiryat Shmona, who have left their homes, who have left everything, who have been uprooted, and putting them on TV, let alone the hostage families, may help create a connection with audiences that are looking for sympathy, but send the message that Israel absolutely does not want to send to Yahya Sinwar. So this is a problem that Israel has to solve, and I don't have an easy solution.
Okay. So since we are just a second, since we are with you, I'm wondering about effects, and in communication theory, usually the media are described as agenda setters. They set the agenda, so to speak. But one of the reasons given for the kind of coverage we see in elite newspapers that it's exactly the opposite. Say, the New York Times is not setting the agenda. It is trying to respond to what they perceive their audiences want to get. And going back to all kinds of polls, public opinion polls, yes, Israel has a problem with young voters, say 18 to 24. But if you look at other age groups during the war, the numbers are pretty high, like 80% support Israel. So is the media that influential or not? I'm asking you.
Is for Lilac?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm asking Owen. You can respond later.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, look, obviously this is a symbiotic relationship that media organizations have with their viewers. By the way, we deal with this at I-24 News in our own way too, right? And every media organization deals with it, particularly news organizations, and CNN is certainly one, that are for profit, and they need to make money, and they're being severely challenged. And it's extremely expensive. I can only imagine how expensive it is to run an organization like CNN. And so they have to give audiences news that is of interest to their audiences. But at the same time, I do think, and again, this is my bias, I guess, as a journalist standing up for the profession, I think most journalists want to do their job well as they see it. And again, going back to some things I said, there are arguments about what that means. want to give people news that they think is not only meaningful to them, but important. And so obviously there is both an agenda, the agenda is set both by the news organization and by the viewers. And that's, I think, a relationship that everyone has to run. You're absolutely right, Eytan. I mean, the numbers, that's the flip side of the coin. And that's the glass half empty, the incredibly terrific numbers that Israel has among older Americans, which are really, really striking. And you're absolutely right. And by the way, of course, those are older Americans that are actually consuming more mainstream media, right? If in the New York Times poll, 35% of 18 to 29s said that they get news primarily from social media, I think that number is at 4%, but I have to check, among Americans 65 or older. So this is a group that, particularly among the legacy networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, they're consuming a lot more of that content than is the younger generation. So in a sense, if the media has, if to the extent that the media has influence, it has influence over that older generation, which is more supportive of Israel. I'm not saying that there's a cause and effect and that the media is necessarily favorable to Israel and so forth, but you're right. I guess it does in a sense call that into question. In terms of the disproportionate different attention that our conflict is given, I think the reality that we all have to reckon with is that there is something about this conflict that just resonates emotionally and at a gut psychological level among wide publics in the United States and certainly beyond it. I don't know that I have a full explanation for it, if it's anti-Semitism, if it's the connection Muslims and broadly speaking, people in poor countries in the developing world feel to this conflict, or evangelical Christians. But there is something about this conflict that resonates extremely widely. We've seen that during this war. Of course, it's not the only conflict that does. Obviously, the war in Ukraine got plenty of attention at its peak and may well again at some point. And there are other major news stories that do. The personality of Donald Trump, God knows that's an item that resonates emotionally with wide circles of people everywhere. So we're not alone in that, but we are among those subjects. And even politically, the New York Times poll, I admit I'm obsessed with it, asking what's the most important issue to them. Only 1% say the Middle East. I don't think that surprises any of us. But I still think this conflict resonates among voters in ways that go beyond the issue itself. And I think that becomes clear looking at the polls. And I think some of that is brought to bear in the way the media treat it and how much attention and space is given to it.
Okay, thank you, Owen. Going back to you, Lilac, can you
Yeah.
say something about the motivation, your motivation to do that long-term study of the New York Times? And have you been surprised by the findings, by the evidence that you have discovered?
I'm going to answer that, and then if I can address some of the things said. My personal interest, I was actually very curious to see if we as Israelis are kind of and then we forget about them, and then until the next thing happens. And that was my motivation to do the 2022 study and really monitor everything published and everything not published in the New York Times. I was really open to find that we are obsessed as Israelis. Regretfully, that's not what I found. I found the opposite. So I was a little bit, surprised for the worse and disappointed. I do want to address some of the things that Richard said and Owen said about the compassion and how can we deal with the compassion, etc. I'm not sure that's where I would put it, because the Palestinians are probably always going to be, always going to suffer more than Israelis, and I'm kind of glad that we don't have to suffer more than them in order to get compassion. And I don't think that's where we should go. I think we should talk about information. I mean, you talked about that poll before, Owen, and 45% of 18 to 24-year-olds, according to one of those polls that was published last week, think that Israel still controls Gaza and not Hamas. So they just don't know. It's almost half of this generation. And it's
Yeah,
because they're not getting the facts. They're not getting the story. And
right. They also think that that it's possible to live an openly gay lifestyle in Gaza.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go there because, you know what, maybe that too, because this information is not brought to them. And this is part of the omitted part of the story. And what I'm saying, I'm not expecting the agenda of the journalists to be on our side. I'm not expecting them to be more compassionate. I'm expecting them to tell the whole story. That's all. There's a whole story. And you can be on the side of the Palestinians. I'm okay with that. It's okay to have an agenda. It's okay to have an opinion. But when you report a story, you should report everything. You can't just scratch out what doesn't work well with what you're thinking, because you're not a journalist anymore if you do that. And I do think that journalism still matters. I think because social media is so strong, journalism matters even more and should be more accurate, because you're definitely not going to get the accurate information on social media. So I think this is what we should fight for. We should fight for disclosure. We should fight for no omitting of important facts. And one other small point is also a critique about Israelis. We as Israelis did not do a very good job with the disengagement, talking about it outside of Israel. We're talking about it so much inside Israel, but outside of Israel, people have forgotten that it happened. And so many people are not aware that it's not occupied. It hasn't been occupied for 18 years. And nobody knows the story because we haven't spoken about it enough. So that's one thing about the Israelis that I do want to stress.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard Landis and Lilac, Sigan, and Owen Alterman for your presentations. I thought this was a very useful discussion. I think we don't discuss this enough. Obviously, there are all kinds of issues that we have raised. These are very complicated issues, both for journalists, policymakers, and public opinion. I believe that audiences still give too much credit to newspapers like the New York Times or television stations like BBC. And I think that the way perhaps to help journalists to do a better job is simply to expose the kind of professional and ethical problems and issues. If every year there are a few cases at the New York Times where the public editor has to confirm errors, and usually they don't like to admit errors, and they use all kinds of vague terms such as clarification or correction. They very rarely apologize. I think that our job, and I hope, and I think that this particular seminar, webinar, is helping all of us to better understand how to consume media in this day and age. Thanks you again, and we hope to see you in one of next webinars at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Thank you.